So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bart Wexler, Dean of the Truman School, and it's my both privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Monroe Paine Distinguished Lecture in Public Affairs. As some of you know, this is a long-standing tradition at MU to bring distinguished scholars, policymakers, public officials to the campus to, in the case of our distinguished scholars, to talk about their current work, to share their ideas, and to engage in dialogue. And we are really very fortunate in having Barbara Crosby and John Bryson with us today. John and I were trying to figure out how long we've known each other, and I think my estimate is now 32 years. We were in grade school at the time. It was, but John and Barbara have made tremendous contributions to, not only to the academic literature with which many of you are familiar, but also to the practice of public administration, public affairs, planning. As I said in an email to the Truman students yesterday, here's an opportunity to meet the authors of books that you will have read in class, or people who you will certainly encounter on a regular basis. So I won't say too much more about them. They are both currently at the University of Minnesota. John is the McKnight Presidential Professor of Public Affairs. Barbara's an associate professor in the Humphrey School and director of their Center for Integrative Leadership that they have jointly with the Sloan School, not the Sloan School, it's the Carlson School of Management, the business school. So bringing together the public and the private sectors to think about the issue of integrative leadership. In any event, they're going to talk a little bit today about the whole notion of cross-sector collaboration and integrative leadership, as the title says, achieving possibility in impossible dreams. So let me turn it over to John and Barbara.
Thank you, Bart, and thanks to everyone for being here. We're always delighted to talk about these subjects and to engage with interested people and people interested in these topics. So Barbara will talk a little bit more about what we're going to do today.
First of all, I want to echo John's thanks and say that we just were privileged to have terrific lunch over at University Club. Was that where we were? And I hope you all didn't eat as well as we did, so that you stay awake through this. And I haven't ever been in a room before where I'm just have this benevolent gaze of Walt Disney greeting me from the back wall. So this is making me feel very welcome. What we're going to talk about is some of our own research on cross-sector collaboration and really home in on the practices of integrative leadership that we think can help people deal with the complexity of cross-sector collaboration. So that will be the focus. We also will give you a chance to think about cross-sector collaborations that you are either involved in, hope to be involved in, or curious about perhaps. And so we'll have some chance for interactive work here today. So just to start out, John and I have for much of our careers focused on how to help groups effectively tackle public problems. And we have focused especially on what might be called impossible dreams. That is, finding sustainable solutions to some of the most complex public challenges, whether it's the AIDS crisis or global warming. And we think that making headway on those complex public challenges really requires participation by all sectors: government, business, nonprofits, community groups, and probably media. Partly because our understanding is that those problems are caused by failures of all the sectors to do what we hope they can do at their best. And so remedies then need to draw on the strengths of all. We have, in our teaching and research, focused especially on several cases. And so we want to spend some time just telling you about those cases And then I'm going to use one of them to highlight practices of integrative leadership. The first one is an effort to end homelessness in Hennepin County, which is the county that includes Minneapolis, Minnesota's biggest city. So certainly an impossible dream. I'm not going to talk about that much right now because that's the one that I'm going to return to later. And then another cross-sector collaboration that we have studied in depth along with our colleague Melissa Stone, who's also on the faculty at Humphrey, is an effort that was put together in the mid-1990s to carry out at the county level the welfare reform legislation that Congress had just passed. And the real challenge there was basically how to find work, good work for all, but the focus being on welfare recipients, trying to get them matched up with jobs. And this particular cross-sector collaboration was one of mixed success or partial failure, however you want to phrase it. The partners there, basically business people, employers in other words, and chambers of commerce, for example, service providers, the welfare recipients themselves, the county system of assisting welfare clients, representatives of all those groups were involved, and they did have some partial success in setting up centers that matched welfare recipients and employers. So we learn as much sometimes for what doesn't work as what does work.
Another set of cross-sector collaborations we've studied were what were called urban partnership agreements, which were federally and state-funded efforts to reduce traffic congestion significantly in, well, initially 5 metropolitan areas. So the idea here was that this is in the second term of the George W. Bush presidency, when all of a sudden Secretary of Transportation Mary Peters ended up with over $1 billion on her hands that she got to decide how to spend because Congress had decided to do away with earmarks temporarily. And USDOT had decided, they'd had the senior leadership of USDOT had talked for some years, and they had decided that traffic congestion in metropolitan areas was the single biggest transportation problem that the country faced. They also decided, based on lots of academic research and some experiments, and real-life experiments in addressing the issue, that what's called dynamic pricing of lanes was the only remedy likely to significantly reduce traffic congestion. It was not possible to build more interstate highways. It was really hard to build light rail and all sorts of stuff, but you could put pricing on lanes that would vary depending on the level of congestion. And if you could pair that with good transit and with telecommuting and with other uses of technology, particularly information technology, real-time signage, for example, you actually could reduce traffic congestion significantly. So initially 5 metropolitan areas were funded. A couple failed, New York City being the prime one. So the money that was left over was given to other territories and so on. So anyway, in the end, we're finishing about 7 years of data collection on 7 different sites. So it's longitudinal data over a number of years on sites. And this is Minneapolis, actually, that you're looking at. This is a Price lane right here. And bus rapid transit on a shoulder lane. And Barb and I live about there. There have been some significant successes in Minnesota and elsewhere, some failures, but it's been a pretty interesting experiment. Another one is, this is a map of the official Twin Cities metropolitan region. This is Hennepin County, where Minneapolis is. So Minneapolis is here, St. Paul is here. This is Wisconsin. This is Missouri. Another cross-sector collaboration we've looked at is Metro GIS, which is a regional geographic information system. It is a completely voluntary association of 300 units of government, businesses and nonprofit organizations. If any of you have read The Logic of Collective Action by Mansur Olson, you know that this organization should not exist. So it exists in practice, but it doesn't in theory. That's a joke. They found important ways of reducing the transactions costs so they could get this collaboration going and running. They have, it's amazing. They have won national, international awards for their work, and MetroGIS is now provides one of the important bases for the national geospatial data infrastructure. So their governance system, the principles they use to govern themselves, and so on.
And I'm sure that only a tiny handful of the people in this room remember when polio was widespread in the United States. John and I remember this. Yes. But this, a vaccine was discovered, a widespread immunization program got underway, and really by probably the 60s, polio was no longer an issue in the US, Europe, and other so-called developed nations. But the disease remained widespread throughout the rest of the world. And starting in the 1970s, Rotary International, an international humanitarian organization with well over 1 million members around the world and about 33,000 clubs, decided to take on or to experiment with the possibility of leading an immunization campaign in some of these countries. So they had a very successful effort in the Philippines, and that gave them then some evidence that it would be possible to try to do something that seemed quite daunting, really impossible, which is to wipe out polio worldwide. So leaders in Rotary took on this campaign in 1985 with the ambitious goal of eliminating polio worldwide 20 years later, 2005, which was the 100th anniversary of Rotary International. Anybody here belong to Rotary? I'm sure there's a chapter probably in Columbia because there are so many around the world, and particularly in a university town, you'd have one, I'm sure. So what happened then was that Rotary couldn't do this on its own. I think that's kind of obvious. They began to build cross-sector collaborations with public officials in the various countries that they were working in, also with UNICEF, with the World Health Organization, with the Centers for Disease Control here in the US, and with researchers and so on, because you need people who can help you track results and all of this. And the result is that 2005 came and went without eliminating polio, but now there are only 3 countries in the whole world in which polio is still endemic, and that's Nigeria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, which, as you can imagine, present some unique challenges. And perhaps you've heard that workers doing some of the vaccinating work in Afghanistan have been attacked and so forth because of the association with the Osama bin Laden capture. But it is remarkable that through this cross-sector collaboration, Rotary and its partners, including in recent years, Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation, have been able to immunize something like 2.5 billion children and mobilized 20 million volunteers. So Rotary did its part of mobilizing volunteers, providing the vaccine, and also building political support, and some of these other organizations did their part. So a really remarkable achievement of possibility in an impossible dream. So we have been trying to understand more about what leadership is like in these endeavors, and we have increasingly begun to understand leadership as working across boundaries to bring diverse groups of people together around shared solutions to common problems. And we have also begun to deepen our understanding of public value, which some of you were here earlier today as we talked more about public value and public values as a way of operationalizing the common good. We've pulled these together in this definition. Integrative leadership fosters collective action across boundaries to advance the common good, or in other words, public value.
So our view is that this kind of leadership is absolutely crucial. I'll stand over here so people don't have to, crick their neck. This kind of leadership is necessary in order to achieve what otherwise would be impossible dreams. So the idea of ending homelessness, many would think is not possible. The idea of actually dramatically reducing urban traffic congestion is not possible. The idea of eliminating polio is not possible. Well, it turns out they are possible. But it's a complicated process of accomplishing those goals, and leadership is crucial. You can think of other things that you might consider impossible, where with the right kind of leadership, the right kind of factors at play, you probably could do something about them. Today, this day, somewhere between 20 and 25,000 children will die globally as a result of of disease coming primarily from poor water supplies. The technology for fixing that is simple and cheap, but absent integrative leadership and the kinds of cross-sector collaborations that are necessary to make something happen, those children are going to die. 20,000 will die tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, until people start doing something about it. 25,000 people or more will die of gunshot wounds in the United States this year. 25,000 people will die on highways this year. Those numbers that doesn't have to be the case, but addressing those problems will require integrative leadership and probably cross-sector collaboration of some kind. So we've come to think about an approach to addressing these otherwise impossible to alleviate problems as including at least 4 components. One is you have to work at multiple levels. It could be national, it could be international in the case of the Polio Plus. Transnational, national, organizational, interorganizational, group, individual, and so on. You need a framework for thinking about cross-sector collaboration. You need a way so you need to understand what goes into making cross-sector collaboration work, and you need a framework for thinking about it. You need, we believe, an appreciation and an ability to engage in a number of different kinds of integrative leadership practices, or what we call integrative leadership practices. And you need tools and techniques. So in this talk, between now and the time we finish, I hope we'll try to finish with enough time for an engagement with you all. We're going to focus on the middle 2. A framework for cross-sector leadership, cross-sector collaboration and leadership practices. Now for we need to hand these out. So I'm going to hand out a diagram that's going to look a little daunting to you. Maybe we can give me half and I'll get the others going down back on this side. So if I could would you be willing to kind of pass some out along the line so we can get them to go further, more quickly? Oh, sorry, let me. So I'm going to present this, you're going to see this framework, and it's going to look pretty messy. Arrows all over the place. Maybe people could share. We could, we can certainly get more copies for you. How many more do we need back there? But is it possible for you to look off someone next to you? Okay, so this is kind of complex and messy, and we're going to also talk about a set of leadership practices that are kind of complex and messy. We're guided by Albert Einstein, who says things should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. I mean, we could give you a very simplistic way of thinking about these things, but we don't think that's actually helpful. So I want to talk you through this diagram quickly. So this is well, actually, let me use this slide first. So addressing these complex public problems does require attention to multiple levels that can run from transnational to the individual. And like I said, we're going to focus kind of at an intermediate level here in this talk. Here's the diagram. So I'm going to talk you through it. So this is our current thinking about how to think about cross-sector collaboration. This framework was developed for a talk we gave at the U.S. Army War College last year. When the Army starts getting into cross-sector collaboration, you know it's probably significant. The reason they're getting into cross-sector collaboration is interesting. They're very good at fighting armed conflicts, and they figure they can beat anybody. Where they have trouble is avoiding conflict in the first place and stabilizing regions after conflict. And the reason they're interested in cross-sector collaboration is it can help them avoid conflict in the first place, if they're good at it, and stabilize regions afterwards, after conflict. I mean, that's why they're interested. We told them we don't know anything about conflict. We do academic politics. Typically, people aren't armed. You know, nobody gets hurt. They said that's okay. That's okay. What we need to know about is cross-sector collaboration. So I'm going to talk you through this. So if you focus on the left-hand side, it's important to think in terms of designing cross-sector collaborations. And you should design as best you could design with as clear a sense as possible as the kind of outcomes you want at the end, without knowing exactly what you're going to get. But you ought to think with the end in mind. So that's this piece up here. And you should think about, we're calling them here first, second, and third order outcomes. You can think about immediate, intermediate, and long-term outcomes that may be desirable or undesirable. And there will be undesirable outcomes. There will be unintended consequences. There will be unexpected things that aren't so good. So you need to think about, in order to get what we really want, what possibly negative or unintended outcomes must we also be able to manage? So you need to think about both of those. In order to achieve outcomes, you're going to have to engage in a set of major activity areas, or what we're calling them. You're going to have to address initial conditions. Well, first of all, you're going to create cross-sector collaborations to do these things. In terms of activities, beyond that, you have to address initial conditions. You're going to have to design effective processes. You're going to have to create an effective structural and governance approach. You're going to have to use the process and the structural and governance approach to manage important contingencies that are likely to arise. And you're going to have to assess outcomes and manage accountabilities. So those kind of big activity areas you're going to have to pay attention to. Let's go through it step by step. So initial conditions involves, again, assessing the very broad general environment, you know, what's going on out there. Identify sector strengths and weaknesses. So we have businesses because they're good at certain kinds of things. We have governments because they're good at other kinds of things. We have nonprofits because they're good at things that neither businesses nor governments are good at, and so on. So these public problems typically arise because of sector failures. So you need to draw on multiple sectors, the strengths of multiple sectors, typically to address the problems, and you've got to find some way to manage their weaknesses. And you need to take into account the immediate direct antecedents of collaboration. Next, you have to design an effective process, which means forging an initial agreement. And typically, it's multiple initial agreements over time that become increasingly operational. Build leadership. We'll talk more about leadership. And leadership of many different kinds. Build legitimacy. Often you have to build legitimacy for collaboration, as well as the specific work that the collaboration is doing. Building trust, being able to manage conflict. There will be conflict. There will be conflict. You have to be able to manage it effectively and well. Engage in both what's called deliberate planning, like thinking in advance exactly what you're going to do, and being able to also plan with what emerges. What's called emergent planning. So figuring things out as you go, because you can't figure out everything in advance. Designing processes that build capacity of the collaboration. Use stakeholder analyses, emphasize responsiveness, and so on. Use inclusive convening to create inclusive structures and inclusive processes. Basically, you got to get the system in the room. You got to get the system in the room. You have to have a process for doing that, and you have to have a process for engaging people doing with that in order to make important headway. So the idea is these situations there are shared power situations where no one's wholly in charge. You got to get people in the room and get them to figure out how to make this thing work. And that's what happened in Heading Home Hennepin. That's what happened in Metro CIS. That's what happened in the Urban Partnership Agreement cases and so on. Let me step over here. So creating effective structural and governance approach, you need to be clear what kind of collaboration are you dealing with here? Is it a lead organization type? Is it a partnership network organization? Is it self-governing? And what kind of collaboration are you dealing with here? Because there are different kinds of collaboration. Basically adapt the structure to context. So it has to, the context and the process both have to, process and the structure have to both fit the context. The structure has to be fit for purpose, as the British would say. Is that the right language? Fit for purpose. I mean, you have horses for courses. All right, better said. Well said. Well said. And an effective governance arrangement. There also will be a set of contingencies and constraints, typically, that arise that have to be dealt with. So one is you got to make use of windows of opportunity. Typically, you need a window opening of some kind to make things happen. So in the case of the urban partnership agreements, all of a sudden, Secretary of Transportation Mary Peters ended up with $1.1 or $2 billion on her desk, and she got to decide how it was spent. Why don't I get a job like that? There was general agreement on the traffic congestion being a problem. They had, anyway, a window of opportunity opened, and 29 metropolitan areas applied. They met the deadline and applied. 9 semifinalists were selected to make final presentations, and 5 finalists were chosen. Where am I at here? Technology, in our studies indicate technology plays lots and lots of different roles. As a communications vehicle, as a motivator, as an integrator. It's important to think of technology very, very broadly when thinking about how to make a cross-sector collaboration work. Lots of different kinds of competencies are needed. Some of them are touched on here, like conflict management capabilities, but project management capabilities, grant writing capabilities, research capabilities. There are all sorts of leadership capabilities. There are all kinds of competencies that are needed. Power imbalances typically need to be managed well, because power will not be equally shared in the room. But if you're going to have an effective process, typically there has to be a process that allows for some power equalization so that everybody gets heard, people get to sign on and commit because they believe they've been heard, their interests have been taken into account, and so on. And particularly in cross-sector collaborations, often you'll have competing institutional logics. Businesses use a different kind of logic than governments do, and then nonprofits do, and then citizens do. And you have to be able to manage those competing logics. And lastly, there's assessing outcomes and accountabilities. So building a system that is organized around co-aligned interests is really crucial, and that, where was I at here? And that also builds on sector strengths. So you're not building on the weaknesses, you're building on the strengths and managing the weaknesses. Have a good tracking system in place, building in resilience and reassessment capacity, because things are always changing, membership's changing, the nature of the task changes, aspects of the environment change, and so on. Building an accountability system in place that relies a lot on good personal relationships, especially with political leaders and other kinds of leaders, and always realizing that it's very difficult to achieve success in a cross-sector collaboration. I mean, you look at a diagram like this and you have to conclude there are many more ways to fail than there are ways to succeed. So if you're going to succeed, you've got to pay attention to a lot and work really hard at making it work. Because again, there are many, many more ways to fail than there are ways to succeed, which is part of where our focus now has moved towards thinking about integrative leadership. You have to be able to integrate across multiple boundaries, across multiple kinds of challenges, multiple kinds of activity areas, multiple levels, in order to make a cross-sector collaboration work. So Barbara's now going to talk about integrative leadership practices, which is another element of this general approach. So what Barbara's presenting will not be fully integrated with this piece, because we don't know how to do that yet. So if you have some ideas, we're really anxious to hear what you have to say.
But before I go there, do people have immediate questions for clarification or comments?
About this one?
I was going to ask, when you were talking about it, it seemed like these are all issues that you should be thinking about or be ready to address right as you get started. Is that, I mean, is there any room to kind of develop as you go along? It seems like if you have to do all of this beforehand, nothing would ever happen.
Right.
You
Well,
can't.
yeah.
But to have something of this framework in your mind as you get started, very important. So, you know, as a good chess player would think about how the game might unfold in a general way at the very beginning. The same is true of cross-sector collaboration. But we talk about the need for emergent planning as you go through this.
Well, and two other things. Often collaborations will fail a couple times before they succeed. And part of that failure is learning what you have, you know, how you got it wrong and trying to fix it. The other thing that Barbara will get to very quickly here is the importance of having good relationships with people at the beginning. Because having really good relationships at the beginning means you've already probably worked on trust, which is really important. You've worked on communication some. That those prior relationships actually help you go a long way. And the things that have gone into building those relationships go a long way to helping you be able to address a number of the points here.
Anything else? Yeah.
When you're initiating a process like this, is it solely the responsibility of the person facilitating it, or should all the collaborators know all of this? And know, I mean, do you try to teach them this, or how do you approach that?
Well,
Seeing that diagram might drive them away. So.
That gives us something to research. You know, it would be kind of neat to follow a process through if you were able to do something like, go through something like what we're doing here today with the whole group that we're going to participate in cross-sector collaboration. The closest we've come, I think, in a way, is John's work with the Metro GIS folks, helping them do action-oriented strategy mapping in order to come up with, do it, in an inclusive kind of process, really laying the groundwork for their governance structures. And so I think in that way, we do have some evidence that having everybody who participates understands at least some part of this is productive.
Well, I think in the UPA cases they were doing the same thing, but they were really working on the fly because they were under a tight deadline as well. But I don't want to jump ahead on too much on it. We should go straight to the integrated leadership.
So let me just comment that kind of to reinforce what John said is that integrative leaders have the unenviable task of paying attention to all of this over extended periods of time and trying to accomplish the common good or public value. So what we think is that some key practices of integrative leadership can really help with this. And so in order to talk about them, I'm going to talk in more depth about Heading Home Hennepin, give you a little of the backstory about this effort to radically alter the way that public officials and civic leaders in Minneapolis and the surrounding communities dealt with the problem of homelessness. So the people that are featured here, the woman in the middle is named Kathy Tenbrook. And several years ago, Kathy, who had a long history of working in the city's shelters, really became determined that there had to be better solutions to the persistent and growing problem of homelessness in the Twin Cities. She saw the problem firsthand in her work at St. Stephen's Shelter and had, started to see that this was a problem that was not going to be solved or significantly remedied simply by relying on the existing shelter system and indeed even expanding it. And she had this impossible idea. Could we eliminate homelessness? She then turned to Gail Dorfman, who was a new county commissioner, and Gail is over here in this photo, and said, would you join me? And actually, she didn't do it quite that politely. She was part of an advocacy group that was demonstrating around the latest problems of people being, overtaxing the shelters and so forth. And she got Gail Dorfman's attention that way and then began talking with her about partnering to try to do something significantly different. And then the two of them recruited Mayor R.T. Rybeck of Minneapolis. And together they organized something called the Commission to End Homelessness that met for 100 days in 2006 and included a diversity of stakeholders. They developed a plan that was adopted unanimously by the City Council and the County Board of Commissioners, and then it was implemented. It's still under implementation. It was a 10-year plan, so outlined steps, plans and programs and projects with a lot of flexibility built in to go through 2016. So many successes have occurred as a result of this. Has homelessness been eliminated in Minneapolis and surrounding communities? No, it hasn't. But very significant changes have occurred as a result, beneficial changes. So I'm going to talk about integrative leadership practices in kind of three categories. One is starting places. The second one is launching and sustaining the collaboration. And then third, focusing on outcomes and accountabilities. And there's a certain kind of interconnection of all of these, but you got to lay them out in some kind of order to get through them, and so that's what I'm going to do. So John mentioned taking advantage of windows of opportunity, and of course part of that is actually helping those windows of opportunity develop. So thinking about the political environment in which you're engaged, the economic environment, the technological, and maybe even ecological and sociological aspects of the environment that may or may not be very favorable to what you're trying to undertake. So in this case, in the Heading Home Hennepin case, what was really favorable was that already the city and the county governments had developed some good working relationships. So, it wasn't unusual for a county commissioner to go to the mayor and say, let's do something. And people at the agency level had some good relationships. So that was important. In 2006, actually the economy was pretty good. And people were, felt like there was a little leeway with public resources that we might be able to do something different. And there were also, growing awareness through the media, through people's experiences, that homelessness was changing. That it wasn't just down and out men anymore. It included families with children. It included young people who were aging out of foster care, for example, or getting kicked out of their homes because they were gay or lesbian or transgender. Veterans, people who were working, couldn't afford homes. And so there was a growing awareness of the change in homelessness, but also that the shelter system, that whole thing wasn't working very well anymore. So that made it possible to walk through a window of opportunity. And then there were things that were in place as a change got underway that needed to be preserved, that could be beneficial. So in the case of tackling homelessness, we have in Minneapolis quite a strong tradition of charitable work by downtown congregations. And we also have a strong tradition of corporate volunteerism. So the people involved with this could say, okay, the political context, pretty favorable. Social conditions and awarenesses, pretty favorable. A sense of urgency around the problem is growing, and we've got some things to work with that we want to preserve as we go forward. So part of shaping and taking advantage of windows of opportunity is really diagnostic work. And then focusing on cross-boundary relationships and this word strategic. Who do we really need to be involved in this? And so using stakeholder analysis to think about, A, who's being affected by this problem, who's got the resources to do something about it, and then thinking about how these people are connected to each other, and if they are not connected, how do we foster those connections that we need to build? And so this, too, is something that goes on throughout that entire diagram that you saw. But I put it at the start because one of the things that's just so clear from our research and from others is that cross-sector collaborations are unlikely to get off the ground if you don't have some kind of strong foundation of positive relations among at least a few of the collaborators. So in this case, you know, Kathy Tenbrook had been active in this kind of shelter and social service network for a long time, and she had some strong relationships in that community. She built strong relationships. She and Gail and RT built quite a strong partnership among themselves. Then this commission was established, and it too then became, you know, a place where relationships were built. And so thinking about not only what exists, but what can be built is part of this work. And then also what they did, as John said, they thought about who do we want to be a part of this? We want to get business people, we want to get clergy people, nonprofits, philanthropists. We want to have people who have been homeless themselves to be on this commission. And so that was important. And important to be sure that they had some folks who could make crucial policy decisions in this public policy area. So they used maybe not formal stakeholder analysis, but certainly thought very strategically about who their stakeholders were and who they wanted to involve in this commission that I mentioned earlier. And then deploying personal and organizational assets on behalf of the change involved. And here we focus a lot on sponsors and champions. Two kinds of leaders that we think are absolutely crucial to launching and sustaining cross-sector collaborations. Sponsors would be people like Mayor Rybeck, like Commissioner Dorfman. They are people with considerable authority, formal authority. They can make policy decisions. They can rescind policy decisions. They can deploy staff, money. They can give an effort visibility and legitimacy. They may not be involved day to day, but when you need them, they can show up and give visibility, promote favorable policy changes, and so on. In this case, there were other sponsors that were involved. I mentioned RT and Gail Dorfman. The commission itself was chaired by the two of them, and also a very prominent downtown clergyman who subsequently activated an anti-homelessness network among downtown congregations, city council member, and also a lawyer, a very prominent lawyer. So that's an example of sponsors. Champions are people like Kathy Tenbrook, who don't have a lot of formal authority, but they've got energy, enthusiasm, competence around the issue. They can connect a lot of diverse stakeholders. So thinking about sponsors and champions. Launching and sustaining collaborations. This you might think about as kind of the middle of it. And focusing on inclusive processes and inclusive structures. Three practices, we highlight three particular practices. The design and use of forums, and within that, so forums would be the settings in which diverse stakeholders can come together and develop shared understanding of a problem and commitments to do something about the problem. And so it would be things like the commission meetings that I mentioned. The need to foster dialogue and deliberation so that these diverse stakeholders can get an idea of the different perspectives in the room. Deliberation to evaluate proposals for action and decide what you're going to do. Framing and reframing the challenge. So often with the, if not always, in the case of these very big challenges, you've got to change the way people think about an issue. So in the case of homelessness, a lot of people just didn't think it affected them until you began to highlight who was involved. And through events and visual images, people like Kathy Tenbrook and her supporters began to help people see the face of homelessness and see how varied it was, and that indeed it might be affecting people you know and care about. They also promoted the notion that it's possible to eliminate it. Just possible that we could end homelessness. And then they highlighted the benefits of prevention, which usually is not a discussion in what do we do about homelessness. So they really reframed the challenge. And then the work of designing and using arenas. So you've got to have an effective way to make decisions within the collaboration and of relating to policymakers that control important resources and decisions. And then enforcing and reinforcing rules and norms in formal and informal courts. In this case, for example, advocating for tenants' rights as part of the process. And then navigating hierarchical and collaborative structures. John mentioned that, of course, when you bring together very diverse stakeholders, some are going to have more power than others. Some are going to be in hierarchical organizations. So you've got to collaborate in the shadow of hierarchy. Hierarchy doesn't go away as you're doing these things, and you've got to keep that in mind. And managing the blend of diversity and unity. In the case of Heading Home Hennepin, one of the ways they did that was to have in their plan numerous kinds of initiatives, and then different groups like the downtown congregations against homelessness could take some portion of it and work on the part that fit their particular passions and their particular competencies. And then finally, outcomes and accountabilities, assessing outcomes and managing results. The Heading Home Hennepin folks had a very tiny office of city and county employees, but they turned to people at the university to help them with their research and, found out what was working, what wasn't, publicized their successes, turned their attention to some of the things that weren't working so well, and then they stayed attuned to a vision of success. The recession happened. The tornado hit North Minneapolis. Things shifted a lot from what they had expected, but they kept their eye on the prize, so to speak, and managed to shift when they needed to and, reset their goals or get new sources of resources. And so they've had a lot of successes getting chronically people off the streets of downtown Minneapolis and into housing. They've stopped so much reliance on picking up people and sending them to detox in the emergency room. They have gotten veterans housed and have organized massive events called Project Homeless Connect several times a year that bring together services in one place for homeless people, activate thousands of volunteers from businesses and congregations, and help bring professionals from lawyers to hairstylists together to really make a difference for people experiencing homelessness. So I hope that's a quick run through that gives you a little bit of a sense of what these integrative leadership practices are all about.
So we had to do 30, right?
Trying to.
So actually a couple of other things that have happened here. Now there's sort of a loose network of people who are really working to end homelessness. I'll just mention two other ones that Barbara didn't mention. These are efforts to change public policy. So the big money is not with the congregations giving money, it's actually with getting tax money to be made available. So one of the two of these big downtown congregations worked and came up with a quite innovative supportive housing project for teens who were either homeless or aged out of foster care. So it provides employment, financial management skills, The teens have to pay rent. They have to follow the rules and so on. The unit was, this 42-unit complex was so successful, it was used as an example in the most recent state legislature that convinced the legislature to give more money to develop more permanent housing for teens. And so another piece of the reframing was that emphasizing that shelter is not a home. What we're trying to do is provide a permanent solution here, which involves a home. So now these same two downtown congregations are working on a pilot project to develop supportive housing for ex-offenders who have, when you have a record, you have a real problem getting credit, getting a bank account, renting, and so on. So they're thinking in the same way. If we can provide a tangible example of success, we can affect the state legislature, and we hope that we can convince them to reallocate money being spent on jailing people or imprisoning them to the much cheaper alternative of preventing recidivism and helping people to, just to stay out of prison. So there's been a very strategic sense here as well. Should we add that Kathy Tenbrook is is a Humphrey grad? We probably should. She's just so terrific. We love to take credit for our grads like that. So let's. I'm supposed to insert a question button here, but imagine a button here to ask for questions at this point. We're actually see that we're short on time. Let me go straight to conclusions and then see if there's any questions. So. Collaborating is really hard work, as I think these examples show. It's not collaboration, and perhaps especially cross-sector collaboration is not an easy answer to hard problems. It's a hard answer to hard problems. There are no easy answers to addressing these difficult challenges. There also is no substitute whatsoever for integrative leadership of the kinds that Barbara was talking about. There is zero substitute for that. These collaborations do not develop without multiple people playing multiple leadership roles. We emphasize sponsor champion. There's also the roles of neutral convener, facilitator, and so on. The initial conditions in the relationships matter enormously. One of the reasons why Minnesota's urban partnership agreement has probably been the most successful of all of these these UPAs, and it's probably because they had very good prior working relationships. The ones that failed or had really struggled, like San Francisco and Chicago, were the ones where they didn't have good prior working relationships. The only one other that really succeeded well was Miami, where they had a unified power structure. They didn't actually have to collaborate very much. The governor was on board right from the beginning. The Secretary of Transformation was on board right from the beginning. And there were two FDOT regions that had to be involved. And the rest of it was kind of minor collaboration. So you can either do Minnesota nice, is what it's called in Minnesota, where you play well with others, or you can do Miami mean, which is like inclusive processes and structures are both really important, especially when you don't have Miami mean working for you and clear lines of authority and somebody's actually more or less in charge. Stability is necessary, but you also have to be flexible and resilient because things change. You learn as you go along. You got a tornado that wipes out one of the poorest neighborhoods in North Minneapolis, and all of a sudden you got homeless people you never expected, and so on. And then this last piece, the vertical accountability up hierarchy, so up through Hennepin County's structure, where the city of Minneapolis structure matters a lot, but so does the horizontal accountability. So let's see if there's another question button. Yeah, a question button right here. So are there any questions for the two of us? Yeah.
These collaborations are so unique and relationships are so important. How do you think it's possible for them to be used as a model in a different place? Or how translatable are these kinds of examples?
Well, what we're looking for, I think what we have concluded, and our colleague Melissa Stone, who we've worked on a lot of this with, have concluded there's no formula, or there's no algorithm or recipe, or there are design guidelines that, in that complex framework we're trying to provide. There's a way of thinking that is probably generalizable, but it has to be adapted to context. And so I think there are things that can be generalized, but they must be tailored to the specific situation. I don't know if Barbara has another.
Well, your question also prompted me to think about the evidence that sometimes when people collaborate together on one thing, it sets them up well to collaborate on the next thing, because then if that experience has been good, they say, oh yeah, I can work with so-and-so on the next thing. And so we saw some of that in the Urban Partnership Agreement, where some people had worked together previously on some corridor transportation planning, and so they knew each other across jurisdictions and across, some business people had been involved and so forth. So they had good previous experience. So an intangible outcome that shows up in the outcomes and accountabilities often is either new relationships or more positive relationships, but an outcome might be people who say, oh, I am never going to get involved with anything like that again. So that's something to think about too. Other comments? Yeah.
Yes, I got two issues. First one is about information openness. I guess transparency or sharing of information between these entities are very important. I'm wondering if, to what extent do these organizations share their information or tell the truth about their nature of their design?
I think it varies. I think, so in the case of Metro GIS, the whole point is to share information. So there's a lot of, and actually, let me mention just one piece about Metro GIS, because it helps illustrate the importance of a governance structure. So in order to help get people to cooperate, so again, remember this is a completely voluntary association of 300 units of government. I mean, why would people do that? So one of the principles, so they started in 1995, and Barbara was mentioning, I've been their strategic planning consultant since the beginning. So one of the things that happened at the beginning was they established a set of guiding principles that they've actually maintained throughout, for 20 years now almost. One of them was, you as a government should do something around GIS because it makes business sense for you to do it. Like, you do it because you're going to do it anyway, right? But if you do it, share it with everybody. Now that principle dramatically increased the benefits of participating, because you, for free, you get something else that someone else has done. It also dramatically reduced the transactions costs, because people want to be in. They don't have to be persuaded to be in. They want to be in because the benefits are so high. So, and then another principle they used was, we're going to make decisions by consensus because we're completely voluntary. There are actually 14 principles that they follow, but they constructed a system of decision making, an inclusive process, inclusive decision making, in such a way that they basically were completely open with one another, and the whole region benefits enormously. There was a threat under a previous governor who wanted to privatize the operation, and so an audit was done to see whether or not this made sense to stay in the public realm. The benefit cost analysis was $6 of public benefit for every $1 of public money spent. And the problem went away. People thought, I wish my pension fund had that kind of return, right? And it's just makes perfect sense. So that's a case where transparency really mattered a lot.
And we should add that they have a governance structure that allows them also to have policymakers who are county commissioners primarily making their policy decisions. So not all the stakeholders get together and do consensus around every policy that they undertake. But when they are working on big-time planning, they do get all the stakeholders together. So one of the genius things that they've done is they've set up a policy board that relates directly to these county boards of commissioners that really are responsible for helping make this possible. And then they have a coordinating committee that has other stakeholders involved. And then they have a technical committee that are, what are they working?
Well, technical task forces.
Yeah, that involve, people from the utilities who know something about parcel data, and people from land use consulting firms and so forth. So
let me add just one other thing, because there would be caveats around what I said. So in the case of the Minnesota Urban Partnership Agreement, Minnesota Department of Transportation, you call yours MoDOT, right? We call ours MnDOT. So MnDOT was a pretty hierarchical organization. But in order to get this, hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government, they had to cooperate with the city of Minneapolis, Hennepin County, suburban groups, the downtown business people, and so on. And what happened was that there was a flattening of the MnDOT hierarchy, and others started coming in more as equals. So the city of Minneapolis, for example, Hennepin County, and people had to share information in order to put together the proposal that would work. So there was kind of what we would call organizational ambidexterity. So the hierarchies flattened so that they could work collaboratively. And then when implementation came about, there were assigned responsibilities back to the participating organizations, and the hierarchies started to reemerge. When the hierarchies reemerged, there was less transparency. Enough transparency to make it work, but there were some concerns then about, well, can we really trust them now? And but anyway, it actually was a pretty successful collaboration.
And
there
you had a question.
And then one back here, yeah.
How would you characterize complexity and communicate that to the collaborative, especially in regards to engaging in deliberate and emergent planning?
If we were instructing people or teaching people about it?
Sure.
Well, I'd probably start with that diagram and say, this is a mess. What are you going to do to manage it, right? You got to work at it. And I probably wouldn't start with the diagram, actually, because, but people, like a lot of the people, like the people involved in Heading Home Hennepin or the Minnesota UPA or Polio Plus, these are pretty shrewd people, pretty savvy. Many of them run big organizations. They get it about things being complicated. And so often it's a matter of just simply reminding them that there are lots of things we need to pay attention to here. And that we're going to have to talk things through and so on. So it's not like the people involved in these situations haven't encountered complexity and complicated situations before. They just need to be reminded of the kinds of things that need to be addressed. I don't know,
but
Barbara
also
may have another...
what you can do if you are able to work together. And so, the examples that we've presented to you today show that these things can pay off. And so one of the things in the Heading Home Hennepin commission work that they did was they started off by listening to people who were or had experienced homelessness. And so that they really got a sense, of what this problem really involves in terms of how it affects actual human beings, but also then got inspired to say, our work matters. And if we can really change the system, it'll affect a whole lot of people, and our community will be the better for it. So, you don't start with the complexity of the task, but rather with the vision about what could be different, and also help people to understand more fully the problem and potential solutions that you could pursue. The other thing is to really highlight the importance of persistence and patience, because you can get good results, but you cannot get them overnight. And it's important to invest in these opportunities for people to listen to each other, to build relationships, and then have the opportunity to work together on agreed upon projects, and then have a way to keep track of those things. So yes, being open about that it is going to be time consuming and complex and so on, but continually emphasizing what are the potential fantastic outcomes that you could get that you couldn't get otherwise. So if you can get them otherwise, then do not do cross-sector collaboration.
Yeah. If you don't have to collaborate, don't. I mean, that's kind of, really, it's a direct message. It's one other thing that we might do. So on that handout, there's the Integrative Leadership Practices worksheet. We might as a beginning exercise, if we were involved, just have people fill it out. Talk about these practices and say, think about a collaboration in which you have been involved. Not necessarily cross-sector, but some kind of cross-boundary collaboration in which you've been involved. And what helped and what didn't help. And just reflect on your own experience about what worked and what didn't work. And then think about how do we transfer those messages to this new endeavor that we're involved in.
We have a question right
Yeah.
here.
I had more of a comment. As I was listening to your lecture, which I enjoyed tremendously, I thought of 3 examples that I know of that sort of fit in with this, and I just wondered if you might comment on one of them from your perspective. One is the Clinton Global Initiative, which I know does a lot of work like this. Another is in the 90s when the New York Police Department developed CompStat with varying partners. And then even another one was way earlier than that with Robert Moses when he developed Central Park in New York City. So those 3 things came to my mind as I was listening to your lecture. I wondered if you might comment on one of those.
I never thought of Robert Moses as a collaborator. What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you actually sort of, you went from pretty non-collaborative to quasi-collaborative to much more collaborative when you got to the Clinton. I'm not sure how much CompStat, how collaborative that really is. You're getting data in the room and you're getting decision makers in the room. So you're getting parts of the system in the room and forcing people to sort of collaboratively problem solve some. And well then,
Right. Right.
okay, so the CompStat process forced the police to work in a more collaborative way around some, okay, right. But often, so just a couple reactions, often collaboration has to be forced on people. And that's a case where actually numbers, data, was used to force, data and accountability relationships were used to force collaboration among parties who otherwise typically wouldn't collaborate. That same thing actually happened in the urban partnership agreements, because the RFP, to which millions, like a lot of money was attached, required proposals that integrated dynamic pricing, transit, those are typically 2 separate funding streams, telecommuting, whole different area, and technology generally. So people who were not used to working together were and you had to have the partners as well, intergovernmentally and across sectors. People were forced to cooperate, and the goal of dramatically reducing congestion and the incentive of big bucks was enough to actually get people to collaborate, actually, not just cooperate, collaborate, who otherwise would not have. And a consequence of it that Barbara alluded to was a new way of thinking developed, and it's corridor thinking. So typically transportation engineers did not think in terms of corridors, they thought in terms of modes. Now they think in terms of corridors. So the Urban Partnership Agreement in Minnesota was around Interstate 35W South. It was nice to be on it as we were leaving the Kansas City airport, or we saw it or something. We probably took a wrong turn to get on it. This took place in 2 southern corridors in the Minneapolis metro area. And now the program's over, but MnDOT is now pursuing this in Interstate 35W going north, the same way of thinking, and Interstate 94 going east. So now it's not so much people being forced to do it or required to do it or having these huge incentives to do it. It's now that this new way of thinking has happened, people are doing it more naturally. It's starting to seem, oh, this is the way we ought to do things. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question at all.
Yeah. And the Clinton Initiative, of course, fosters multiple initiatives. He provides a forum, and he invites people to come there and start matching up with each other to carry out projects. And so it'd be, a hotbed, really, of, cross-cultural, cross-geography, cross-sector kind of work. And I hope some of our colleagues are actually studying more the outcome of some of those initiatives to see what happens as a result of them. I wanted to add to the talk about mandates. You know, these things are kind of double-edged. In other words, sometimes groups really resent having a mandate imposed upon them. And so if you're involved in a cross-sector collaboration where some people are just only there because they've been forced to be there, or, you know, or decide, well, I'm going to come because I have to, but I'm going to make this not work. You know, so you have to also be aware of kind of the double-edged side of mandates. So incentives help, sometimes crises or a sense of failure of previous solutions help, but you know, often these things carry some price. And the UPAs that John talked about, there was an exclusion of the Federal Highway Administration, an intentional exclusion. Yet when some...
in the Minnesota UPA.
Yeah, in the Minnesota UPA. But later on, they had to be re-involved. And so, you know, you have to kind of think about the various implications of who you invite to the table, who you leave out, whether you use mandates and so forth.
Think about this as an arrangement. I mean, think about this. The Secretary's office is, in connection with MnDOT, is actually ignoring a part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. This caused a little trouble. But had they not been excluded, the deadlines probably would not have been met.
So we are entirely uncertain when this is supposed to wrap up, but we think it's about now.
I'll ask him later.
Okay. Well, it's my job, as Dr. Whiteshaw has disappeared, to thank Barbara and John very much for a stimulating day.
Oh, you're most welcome.
And it's been great to see you and to have you here in the Truman School.